Thanks everyone for coming along today. I'm Ben Matthews, PhD student at the University of Edinburgh. I'm going to be presenting the first findings of my research looking at patterns of convictions in Scotland over the period of the crime drop. And the findings of this research have led to the question that says as the title for the presentation, where have all the young offenders gone? Okay. This question comes from two key findings from this research that I'm going to be discussing today. The first is that the decline in convictions in Scotland since the late 1980s is concentrated in a drop in convictions served to young people. Second, this decline is not evenly split by sex. For most of the period of declining convictions, this drop in young people is exclusively in young men. However, in the last 5 years or so in the data, there have been declines in convictions for both young men and young women. Okay, so why do this research? From previous research, we know that there are very distinctive patterns of ageing crime with more convictions served to young people than to old people. This is normally referred to as the age crime curve. Second, we also know that typically more men than women receive convictions. And as we've already seen, there have been a drop in crime rates in many countries in Western Europe, including in Scotland. So taking all of this past research together, by looking at patterns of crime with age and sex over the crime drop, we can gain an insight into who it is that has shown these declines in offending. We can do this by looking at the distribution of age in crime in Scotland for each year between 1989 and 2012. For this, we're going to be using descriptive statistics, so the mean, the median, and the mode of the distribution of age in crime, as well as two less common statistics, the skewness and kurtosis of the distribution, but I'll explain what those are later on. And we're also going to look at some visual analysis of these trends over time. Okay. The data for this study comes from the Scottish Offenders Index, which I'll refer to as the SOI. The SOI is compiled from court records and contains a record of every conviction in Scotland between 1989 and 2012. Importantly, we must note that this data set only covers crimes that have been convicted. And so as a result, we don't really know for sure whether the trends observed here are due to changes in behaviour out there or behaviour in places like this, or in courts, or the way the justice system are processing offenders. We should also be aware that the SOI also omits some crime types, such as crimes against the court and most traffic offences. And it only includes one record per conviction, which is the most serious offence. For this presentation, the data have been coded for the individual's age at the time of offence and the year in which the offence was committed. And they've been weighted by the mid-year population estimate for each age in each year to account for changing patterns of demographics over time. And finally, just one more point on this. We should note in recent years the dataset won't include cases that are still being processed by the criminal justice system in the way that it's been coded here. So there may be some underestimation of the overall volume of convictions in the last year of the data. Okay, so before breaking down by age and sex, we can look at the overall trends in convictions in the SOI. This is trends in police recorded crime. We've seen this graph a couple of times today, so I won't really go into it too much. But if we put up the SOI figures on here as well, we can see the dashed blue line is the total number of convictions in the offenders index, and the dashed red line are the total number of individuals convicted in the offenders index. So the blue line, the total number of convictions is incidence, and the dashed red line is called prevalence. And we can see that, broadly speaking, there are similar trends with these two types of data. Obviously, the data themselves aren't directly comparable. Police recorded crime and people convicted by courts are measuring different things, but the trends in the two data sets are broadly similar. Okay, and just to briefly go back to the point from a second ago, we can see that the two dashed lines, they both have this drop between 2011 and 2012. So when more data comes into the data set next year, there might be a slight levelling up of that line. Okay. So now that we've seen the overall pattern of declining convictions, we can see how this varies first by age. This will show us that the decline is mostly concentrated in convictions to young people. So just to get a handle on some of these statistics and what they're showing us, This is the age crime curve for the whole data set, so the whole period of 1989 to 2012. We've got in here the mean, median, and mode. That's the light red line, the light green line, and the light blue line. I'm going to have to do some waving about with my arms to show skewness and kurtosis. So we see here most of the distribution is concentrated at the younger end of the age spectrum. If we imagine a distribution where rather than being over here, the peak was sort of more towards the middle of the x-axis, that would be less skewed. So skew sort of relates to where the mass of the distribution is located. And kurtosis, relatedly, is about the amount of peak in the distribution. So a distribution with more of the mass centered around the peak, wherever that may be, has higher kurtosis than one with less of the mass centered around the peak. Okay. So I should also say that on this graph, the blue curve represents the total number of convictions, and the red curve, again, is the number of individuals convicted. Right. So if we look at the change in these measures over time, we have the mean, median, and modal values of a population of offenders here. Basically, we can see that there is a general kind of aging effect throughout the period that we're looking at. Okay, so the mean age of those convicted has increased by almost 4 years between 1989 and 2012. The median age of those convicted has increased by 5 years. While we have this reasonably stable modal age of conviction, there's a sort of a jump just at the end in 2012. So we know that the overall number of convictions has gone down. The average age means that the ratio of young people to older people receiving convictions has decreased. However, from these figures, we don't know where these changes are spread in the distribution. There could be declines for both young and old people of different magnitudes, or there could be declines in young people, but increases in convictions for older people, which is the value of looking at skew and kurtosis. And if we do this, we can see that there has been significant change in these values over time. So the blue line here is skew, and the red line is kurtosis. The distribution of aging crime has been positively skewed throughout, but decreasingly so. And the same is even more true for the red line kurtosis, which shows quite a lot of the distribution is centered around the peak at the start. But as time progresses, we can see that the weight of the distribution is moving away from the peak. What does this mean? Well, substantively, as we know that the peak of the age crime curve is centered around young people, this shows that there's been a decline in youth convictions. Okay. So we can see this visually if we compare the age crime curves for each year over time. Again, we have the blue line representing incidence and the red line representing prevalence here. The figure from 1989 shows basically what we would expect from the overall figure and previous research, with a big peak in youth convictions. But if we compare the curves over time, we can see that there are substantial declines in convictions to young people, up to about the age 30, but slight increases, although much less overall change for people older than that. Highlight this change in the distribution over time, we can overlay the age crime curves for 1989 and 2012. And here we see the substantial decrease both in the total number of convictions and the number of people convicted between 18 to 30. Also a very slight increase in these figures for people slightly older than that. Okay. It can be, again, still quite difficult to catch these trends with the animation. And as an aside, John's presentation next is going to show some really fantastic ways of visualizing all this data at the same time. But we can see these divergent trends even more clearly when we split them by age band, which we have here. So most obviously we see a substantial decrease in convictions served to the youngest age group, which here is those 16 to 20 over time. This goes from being the group receiving the most convictions by some considerable amount at the start of the data to being only the third highest group in 2012. There are also sizable declines for the 21 to 26 age group, which declined by almost a third. In contrast, there is much less change for those over 26, with the exception of these slight rises in the early 2000s. taking all these results together, you can see that the overall decline in convictions is mostly concentrated in young people. When we split the data by sex, we can see, segueing seamlessly into point 2, this decline in convictions rate is not the same for men and women. Okay, so we have again the same descriptive statistics as before. We can see that there's actually some amount of convergence over time over the course of the crime drop. So we see an increase in the mean age of convictions for men of about 4 years between 1989 and 2012, most of which happens after about 2000. Whereas for women, the mean age of offending actually declines slightly from 29 years in 1989 to about 27 and a half in 2000, which is the same value as that for men. They move kind of in concert together up towards the end of the data set when they have effectively the same value at around 31 and a half. So we have the mean age of convictions both increase from the late 20s in 1989 to the early 30s in 2012. For men, the median age of conviction increases throughout the period that we're looking at. Although the increase from 2007 is much faster. It goes from 25 in 2007 to 28 in 2011. For women, the median age fluctuates between about 25 and 24 between 1989 and 2000, and then increases to 26 in 2003, remains there for a few years, and then jumps up to 29 by 2011. Okay. And finally, the modal age of offending here, which is, in other words, the peak of the age crime curve, is mostly stable for men throughout, before having this peak in the final year of the data. And then for women, there's a lot more variation, especially in the last 5 years. I think this extra variation in the peak of the age crime curve for women is perhaps a result of a smaller number of women receiving convictions, as we'll see later on, but perhaps also less difference between the crime rate at peak age and other similar ages, which we can perhaps catch better in when we graph out this distribution visually, which we haven't done yet on the next slide. So these are the figures for skew and kurtosis for the age crime curves for men and women. There's, broadly speaking, a convergence of these figures here. For men, both figures decline reasonably steadily throughout, whereas for women, there's more stability in the first sort of 10 years or so. There is this kind of wobble in the figures for kurtosis. So basically, the starting points for the shape of the age crime curve for men and women, they start reasonably far apart and then grow more similar over time. Okay. So here we have index trends. As Susan described before, the indexing compares the convictions rate for each age band with itself in 1989, so we can pick up the different trends over time. This graph is kind of a big old mess. So if we split it up and look at age groups separately, first we focus on older individuals. We can see that the groups for between sort of 31 and 45, they have this kind of hump in the sort of the early to mid 2000s, and then a slight trailing off, but not that much. Whereas if we compare these figures for the age bands for young people, we can see that for men we have this decline that runs through the 2000s. Then there's a bit of stability, and then it drops again after 2007. Whereas for women, we don't get this drop until about 2007. Okay. So there's been a whole load of graphs. So summing up all these changes then, these results show that declines in convictions in Scotland over the course of the crime drop concentrated in declines in convictions for young people, especially young men. Convictions for young men declined throughout the 1990s and again after about 2007, whilst convictions for young women only declined after 2007. Contrast, for older members of the population, they haven't shown these declines. Instead, they've shown slight overall increases in convictions over the period of the crime drop. This raises one obvious question: why? And in short, well, we don't know. I think Brian did a really good job in the first presentation of showing the wide variety of different theoretical explanations that have been offered for the crime drop and what processes are driving these changing patterns. It may be that better security measures, such as car immobilizers and door and window locks, are leading to declines in convictions, especially for theft. It may be, I guess, and relates to Simon's question from earlier on, that the patterns that we're seeing here reflect more the way that the justice system is dealing with people that are going through it, especially with young offenders, leading to these declines in youth convictions. I think what this analysis can show is that explanations of the crime drop must be able to account for these divergent patterns across different age groups. And this sort of takes us back to where we started, raising the question of, well, where have all the young offenders gone? And that's me. Thank you very much.